So, hello everybody. I'm glad that I can welcome you to this panel, Disinformation and Fair Elections. And last week I was still campaigning in Germany, and only today, I had a quick glance at a study that has been published only, let's say, some days ago. And that already showed that even in this German election campaign, some political actors try to spread disinformation, try to influence the electoral process, and that they use this dissemination of disinformation as a political tool or as a component of their political campaign. And especially some parties, those of the center and their respective representatives, were affected by these attempts. And what we can already conclude after this intense electoral campaign is that to a minor extent, in this case, disinformation has been spread in order to obstruct the freedom of choice of voters, to blur transparency, and also to harm an open and democratic discourse based on the exchange of the political argument. And we have also seen this, or we have already seen this in the past, when data generated by Facebook has been misused by Cambridge Analytica. We will talk about that later, and we will get back to it later during this panel. And those data has been used by Cambridge Analytica or targeted at the users with a clear political objective, meaning to influence their political behavior and their voting behavior. And we've seen this in the 2016 the US presidential elections, and also in the Brexit referendum campaign. And that is why Facebook promised prior to the German elections to make that elections their top priority, whatever that means, if Facebook promises something like that. But one of the reasons why we depend so much on, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg's goodwill and also his promises is that we don't have proper regulation for our digital world, for today's digital world. And I want to change that. My name is Martin Schirdewan, and I'm a member of the European Parliament. I represent the left group here in the European Parliament, and on behalf of my group, I work on both the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And I'm very glad to discuss tonight this very complex topic of disinformation and fair elections with three excellent speakers and panelists, whom I warmly welcome to this panel. And I also want to introduce you now in the order of your presentations that you will give us right now. So the first speaker tonight will be Dr. Sanne Kruikemeier. A warm welcome from my side. Sanne Kruikemeier is an associate professor for political communication and journalism at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam, and her research focuses on the content and effects of online communication in a political context. And she is also interested in data-driven online targeting, online news consumption, and digital journalism. So warm welcome to you, Sanne. And the second speaker of tonight's panel will be Brittany Kaiser. Brittany is nowadays a data transparency advocate, and in his former career, you've been a business development director for Cambridge Analytica. I already mentioned Cambridge Analytica before. And in your memoir called Targeted, you draw attention to the dangerous exploitation of personal data. And you are now also the founder of Own Your Own Data, of the Own Your Own Data campaign, and one of the co-founders of the Digital Asset Trade Association, a non-profit organization lobbying for legislation and policies protecting individuals' rights to control their own digital assets. A warm welcome also to you, Brittany. And the last speaker of tonight's panel will be Professor Simon Hegelich. Simon Hegelich is a professor for political data science at the Technical University of Munich. He is an expert on manipulation in social networks and how computer-controlled users influence the public opinion. And he did also some research focused on micro-targeting in the last European election campaign. Also, a very warm welcome to you, Simon. I'm glad that I have you all three with me tonight, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion. To explain to our auditor very briefly the structure of this panel, we have 1 hour and only 1 hour sharp, so we will finish at 6 p.m. And after your short presentations, we will have a discussion if time is left among us here, and then I will open the floor for a Q&A session for our auditory, for those who are listening to us, to your presentations. And there should be a question and answer tool somewhere in the toolbar of this program, so you should find, and you can already write your questions in there, and then they will be conveyed to me, and I can raise those questions and convey them to our speakers. So let's start with the presentations. Sanne, to get a better understanding of what is actually happening or what is actually going on, I would like to ask you to give us a short overview over the risks and effects online communication and especially targeted advertisement might have or can have. I know that you are an expert in this field, and could you give us maybe some insight of your research, please, Sanne? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So when I started doing my research, I started writing my dissertation, Obama was just elected. And there was a lot of optimism about social media, how it could mobilize people, for instance. And you see that the narrative basically shifted. It became more focused on the negative sides. So the difficult implications for democracy, for instance, especially with Brexit, Cambridge Analytica, but also the election of Trump. And I'm very much interested in my research in the extent to which the beneficial effect trump the negative effect. So I'm trying to understand under which conditions targeting can be beneficial, but under which condition it has also a negative effect. And if you think about the effects of targeting or online micro-targeting, we think always a little bit in the effect on citizens, for political parties, and we talk about the effects on public opinion. So if you think for citizens, right, it can be invading privacy. Targeting uses a lot of personal data from people and using that personal data to target specific messages. And it also can be used in a way to manipulate people. You can target specific voters with specific messages to either mobilize them to go out and vote, but also to demobilize them to go out and vote. So that's very much a negative effect. But it can also have a positive impact. We see, for instance, that you can also use targeting, for instance, to reach people who are difficult to reach otherwise via traditional media, for instance. And especially during the Dutch elections, where there was no opportunity to do any traditional campaigning, social media can be used in a beneficial way. And it can also really lead to more political relevant advertising, for instance. For parties, there's a lot of benefits, right? So political parties, it's cheaper. You can also use it in an effective way, right? So political parties don't have to own a lot of data. They can just go to Facebook and ask, can I target specific voters with this type of message? On the other hand, other forms of targeting can be more expensive, and you give a lot of power to these intermediaries, right? To Google, to Facebook. They own the data. They have all the information, and they get a lot of power by that. On the other hand, we see also that for public opinion or the more macro level, we see that it can have a positive impact, right? It can lead to campaign diversification. You can send different messages to different people. People know more about different topics. You can try to make them more interested in issues which are relevant to them. But on the other hand, it can also lead to polarization, right? Or to a fragmented public sphere, because you send all these different messages to different people, so don't get one message, and it's also very difficult to, as a journalist, for instance, to look back on all these different messages and see what do political parties promise, and do they also hold those promises they make, which is more easier with traditional media. So there, on the one hand, there are a lot of benefits, but there are also a lot of possible threats to democracy. And what do we know if we look at the academic literature? What do we actually know about this? I think the literature is very still also fragmented. We see some experimental work, mainly have been done in the US. And the first indication of this type of targeting practices, we see that they have some effects. They can lead to different voting behavior, for instance. Some effects are smaller. That's what we see in our own research. But we still need to find out a lot about this because, what I said before, most research has been done in the US. We don't know how this is affecting us in the European Union, for instance, where you have way more parties in each country, especially in the Netherlands, where we had like 17 parties in the last election that got elected. So there is a lot of competition. So the first evidence that we see now is that there is some effect of targeting. It leads to different voting behaviors. So that's, I think, the most important conclusion if we look at what are the beneficial effects and what are the negative effects. And we see some effects, but we need to find out more how this is actually working, right? So under which conditions does it have a negative effect, under which conditions has a positive effect? And that's also something which I do now at the moment in my research, to look, for instance, for which citizens are more affected, right? So there are some indications that people with less political knowledge are more affected with political targeting, but to what extent is still unknown, and we need to do more research in this respect.
Yes, thank you very much, Sanne, for giving us this overview. Maybe I could ask, because you were mentioning those who are targeted, are people aware of that? Are they aware of being targeted? Are they aware of the risks? So who's actually being targeted? And if they are aware of being targeted, then they can still make, let's say, their own choice. But if they are not aware of it, then they are only object to some political communication, but not subject of the political process anymore. So that is something that I would like to ask you now. Maybe you can answer that. Is there any evidence about that? Did you find out anything about it?
Yeah, so what we also study is to what extent people actually see that they are targeted, right? Do they see the ads on, for instance, Facebook? And one of the ways to let people know that they are targeted is using labels, sponsored by, so that they are aware that this is not a normal message on their Facebook wall, but it is actually targeted to them specifically. And what we see in research is that most people don't see the label. So they are not very much aware that they are targeted. They just see it through all the other posts from their friends and families, and then they see a political ad, but they're not aware that they're targeted. That's mainly what we think a reason for that is that there is also some kind of banner blindness, especially online. We see so many labels that we are immediately focusing on the content of a message and less on the labels that are there. So I think it's very much important to make people aware about the fact that they're targeted, because most people don't know that that's actually happening. And I think labels are one way, but we need more evidence how that can be more effective so people actually see it.
So thank you for that introduction and answering my question. I would like to pass the word now to Brittany. Brittany, you know firsthand what was a negative impact targeted advertising or targeted political advertising can have, since you worked for Cambridge Analytica. Could you tell us more about your experiences at this time? And could you also, since you are aware of the risk, could you also tell us about your change of position? And because now you're advocating for transparency and the protection of personal data.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor to be here with such a wonderful panel and such a high level audience to discuss what I think are some of the most important issues in terms of us trying to figure out as a global community how we actually protect our democracy when we are living nearly a completely digital life, especially over the past year and a half during the coronavirus shutdown. So I'm really glad that Dr. Kruikemeier actually started her remarks by referencing that she began her research during the Obama campaign, because that's actually where I began my work. I was one of the first people to join the new media and digital team on the Obama campaign. And that was while I was studying to be a human rights lawyer. And I was really excited about the potential for technology and driven campaigning and communications to actually have a large scale positive effect on democracy. During the Obama campaign, I saw that the more data we used and the more social media tools we employed for the campaign, the more people would actually register to vote, the more people that would bring their friends and their families with them to rallies and get involved in the political process, get excited about voting, get more engaged and involved in what their politicians were promising and what that would actually look like for themselves and their families. So many years later, when I joined Cambridge Analytica, I was looking forward to learning how to use more advanced tools than we were using on the Obama campaign. But unfortunately, a lot of those tools did not end up causing what I would call any sort of positive effect on democracy. One of the first times that I really started to question the data collection methods, let alone the micro-targeting methods, was when I saw our senior data scientists at Cambridge Analytica designing different Facebook tools, specifically games and applications that would trick Facebook users into giving their data away. Some of these apps were called the Music Walrus. So it was an app that would pop up and ask you what your favorite music was. And then there was something called the Sex Compass, asking more about your preferences and sexual orientation. And these were meant to be fun things that you would share with your friends. But unfortunately, what the back end was actually doing was taking that data in order to use it for political micro-targeting purposes. This is the first time that I really saw the large-scale deceptive practices of what eventually would become micro-targeting. And throughout my years there, I started to see that some of the micro-targeting strategies were not obviously disinformation or were not obviously negative campaigning. But when you actually looked at what the targeted group was, as well as what the advertisement contained, you could see that a specific group was going to be shown that advertisement to change their perception. So while the advertisement itself may not have been offensive or may not have contained specific inaccuracies, the intended purpose for a particular group of voters was for them to see that advertisement based on their data or who they are or their actions and their behaviors and change that in a certain way. So I did not actually work on the Trump campaign. So a lot of the campaigning tactics and strategies I was shown after the campaign when they did something called a post-mortem. All of my colleagues at Cambridge Analytica that had worked on the Trump campaign presented to us and the rest of the company what they had actually done. This was about 4 weeks after the 2016 election in December 2016. And what they showed us was, for instance, that they had taken an old speech from Hillary Clinton where she had used the term super predators, and they had chopped and changed that with different speeches she had made throughout time, and then showed that specifically to young African Americans who were modeled to be less than 50% likely to vote. So when you saw an ad that had clips of Hillary Clinton, making speeches over the past many decades, you wouldn't obviously see that there was any negative intended purpose of that. But when you saw the group it was targeted at and the data about those individuals and the modeled data of their likelihood to participate in the election, looking at the entire process, it becomes obvious that that is intended to be shown to individuals who perhaps might not show up to vote in the first place if they see enough of those types of ads. So I think one of the biggest problems right now and throughout the past many years is that we are focusing on what advertisements are shown to people without actually thinking about the entire data-driven micro-targeting process. How were those individuals put into a group? What information about them makes them worthy of targeting? And then what is shown to them for what intended purpose? If you were to look at that entire process, it becomes obvious that that could be considered something that was meant to suppress those citizens' votes. And voter suppression is something that we already have laws to protect us against. Although traditionally we're looking at voter suppression as people who are waiting in long lines and may be told that the booth closes earlier than the voting booth actually does. Those are more traditional voter suppression tactics that you perhaps have seen or read about or researched before. But what about the example that I just gave, where a group of people are shown an ad where you're not sure what that intended purpose is of the ad until you look at the entire data-driven micro-targeting process behind it? Then it becomes obvious what that strategy is intended to do. So one of the issues that I have is that not just on the Trump campaign, but on many campaigns since then, and even campaigns that are being run today, that we do not have transparency into that data-driven decision-making process. What data is shown to whom and how for what purposes? When I was on the Obama campaign, we worked under strict ethical guidelines about how we used people's data. We were only to send out positive messaging, no negative campaigning at all for any purpose, not against fellow Democrats and not even against Republicans. So for the Obama campaign, we pumped out 100% positive content, which completely took out a lot of the ethical quandaries that I could have perhaps seen at that time. If you are working on a campaign and you see a campaign that does not have those types of ethical guidelines, then the ways in which they are using data on the back end that are not transparently shown to researchers and that are not disclosed by platforms like Facebook become so much more important, because the intended purpose is not obvious if we do not have that transparency. So what I have been campaigning for specifically is that we need more transparency into this process for those that are going to spend political advertising funds on platforms like Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else. What group of people are you targeting and for what purposes? And therefore, what information are you showing to them? And does that abide by the laws that we already have? I think a lot of people get caught up in questions of how do we make these platforms more ethical? I think we need to start at a more basic level, which is how do we get these platforms to enforce laws that we already have? We have laws against voter suppression. We have laws against incitement of violence. We have laws against incitement of racial hatred, for example, and discrimination. We have not yet been able to get platforms like Facebook to at least abide by the laws that we already have in place to protect people's human rights and voting rights. So our legislators and our regulators need to spend more time engaging with researchers and with technologists in order to have a very in-depth technical understanding of how these tools are actually used and employed. That way we can craft laws that contain more useful provisions that are actually enforceable. And I'll give one last example before I conclude, which is that, for example, in GDPR, we have a concept called purpose limitation, meaning that if you are collecting data for one purpose, you then cannot repurpose that data and use it for something else. So that would have prevented, for instance, people using Facebook to collect data for an application that is a personality quiz, or, as I mentioned, something about your favorite music or your sexual orientation. Those types of apps or games or quizzes, you would only be able to collect that data if people opted in just to share that data in order to get the results of their quiz. You would not be allowed to use that for advertising or for political purposes. This past year, I helped write the first law in the United States where purpose limitation of data was a core component of that law. We wrote the Coronavirus Contact Tracing Data Protection Act for the state of New York, where during the rise of the BLM movement and peaceful protests last June, this was at the same time that governments and big companies like Google were starting to collaborate on contact tracing. So what we said in this law was, if your data is going to be collected for the purposes of public health, then it could not be shared with law enforcement, who could then use that data to target peaceful protesters, for example. So our laws need to become more technical. Our legislators and regulators need to spend more time with technologists and with researchers like the incredible people that we have on this panel here. And I think it's not just important for our democracy, but important for the upholding of our human rights and the laws that all of us in almost every country around the world have already agreed to. So let's start there. And with that basic enforcement, I think we will see really strong continued improvement on the standards that we actually have for our digital life.
Thank you very much, Brittany, for sharing with us your experiences and also for your proposals to better regulate the platforms. We are working on it, as you know, for the time being here in the European Parliament, and many of those things and proposals you just made, like better enforcement structure, liability, ethical guidelines, the disclosure of what is going to happen with the data collected, transparency, etc. These are actually key questions. I would like, with that background presented by Sanne and by Brittany, to give the floor now to Professor Simon Hegelich. Since we are already talking about micro-targeting and also political advertisement, could you tell us, Simon, more about your findings about the micro-targeting in the European context, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for letting me talk here, and thank you for putting together such a wonderful panel. And I think it's many important things have already been said, so I can cut some things a little bit shorter. So first thing is, often there is a question, is micro-targeting in the political context working at all? So some people still are saying it is not working. And I think this question is already answered. It was answered in 2012 when Facebook started a huge scale experiment and used the Facebook platform in an A/B experiment testing to manipulate voter turnout in the US. So we know already that social media can have an effect on turnout, voter turnout. And as already discussed by my fellow speakers, this might, of course, have a negative effect as well. So if you can activate people to go to vote, then probably you can also activate people not to go to vote, demobilizing them. It's still an open question if you can, in the short run, change political opinions. This is an open question everywhere. You don't know if any kind of advertising you see out in the streets is changing your opinion, really. But I don't think this is so important, because especially if you think that we see in the last years more and more elections that are more or less coin flips, and it's just about tiny percentage that is relevant in the end to get the majority. This means that micro-targeting, even if it has a small effect, may be very, very crucial. So what did we find out in the European election? We were looking at micro-targeting for the German parties during the European election. And quite surprisingly, perhaps, and I think this is still the case if you look in Europe, micro-targeting did not play such a big role. We found that, especially in Germany, the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party were using micro-targeting, and we could somehow reverse engineering the targeting a little bit so that we knew something more from the data that was Facebook given to us, who was targeted there, but it's not really transparent. Especially the Conservative Party in Germany, in this election, in the last European election, did not really use micro-targeting at all. They were just rolling out their advertising to everyone. And the question is, why did they do this? And I think the most important answer to this is micro-targeting is too expensive for European parties right now. If you look at the Trump campaign, I think Trump spent $68 million on online campaigning in the last campaign. So this is enormous. And we don't see this amount of money floating into campaigns in Europe in general. There are reasons for this, different laws and whatever. But from this, we can now, I think, see three main dangers of micro-targeting in the political process. So first of all is, just because we don't see much of micro-targeting right now, it doesn't mean that this will stay the same. So the first danger is that either any actor with a lot of money goes into this game and finds a way to finance micro-targeting for a party. The other possibility of this is, for some actors, it's free. For some actors, they don't have to pay for this. Facebook don't have to pay for their own micro-targeting. And we are seeing now the development, and I think this is the most dangerous development in the whole context, that Facebook is becoming more and more, and of course it's not only Facebook, it's Facebook, YouTube, and so on and so on. But Facebook is becoming more and more political engaged by taking down fake news, for example, or by taking down whole networks that are put into a connection that they spread fake news or whatever. On the same hand, Facebook has developed in the last years probably the best censorship machine in history, based on the work of the fact checkers, because the fact checkers are, what they are really doing for Facebook is that they are giving training data to the Facebook algorithms, how to find out how to silence different opinions, which is quite difficult from a computer science perspective. So I think the biggest danger is that companies like Facebook will engage in political campaigning themselves and take a more active role, like a political editor. And as far as I know, there are no laws preventing this at all. So this is a real danger. The second big danger I see is that first was someone else is buying in this game. Second is Facebook is doing this, and the third then is on a different level. We should not forget that what we see online is not really the political discourse. People behave differently online than they behave offline. Different people are online than are offline, and so on and so on. And what is happening now, and what we could see, I think, in the general election in Germany in the last weeks, is that the more the parties are engaging in micro-targeting and the analysis of social media in general, because most of the advertising the parties are doing on social media is free for them. They are just posting Facebook posts and sharing this to their members and friends. I think what we could see there is that parties start to look at these data from social media to find out which kind of policy is working, which political turn is working in the election. And now we get in the end politics that are as stupid as social media, because social media is not really made for a political process. The whole business model behind social media is that we are forced by very complicated algorithms to engage with the content that is presented to us. And this leads to a lot of arousement, it leads to polarization. It's very clever for Facebook and for YouTube because it means they can show us many different things, they learn a lot about us, and they can show us a lot of advertising. But this is not the goal of a political discourse at all. So what we are seeing now is that politicians have something like a perceived voter model. So they think they know what the voters want because they are looking at Twitter and at Facebook, and they are changing their political behavior in a way that it generates likes. And this is the most stupid thing we can do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much also for these blunt words at the end. I can assure you that I always try to do smart politics and not politics based on the social media perception. Of course, I also use Twitter, etc. But I don't let's say think that a tweet is what people also want in real life. Usually I can make this distinction there. But all right, so let me, before we will open the floor for a question and answer session, just raise one question to the three of you. And I would like to ask you to answer quite briefly. We have a discussion here among the political groups in the European Parliament about targeted advertisement. Some are, let's say, in favor, and me personally, I am as well, of banning targeted advertisement. Some are less enthusiastic about it, and some are strictly against it. What would be your position about banning targeted advertisement? Maybe we start with Sanne again, and then Brittany, and then Simon.
I think banning targeting is not a good idea. We don't know that much about also the positive effects, right? We see also some research that shows if you use targeting to mobilize voters, it can also mobilize those voters who are difficult to reach otherwise, right? Via other traditional media, for instance. So completely banning it, I think it's not a good idea, because you cannot use this as a vehicle to also mobilize or interest some groups in politics. And I think what is very important is to regulate it. It's also a little bit what Brittany also saying. It should be transparent how this is happening, but it should also have regulation, which can be enforced also upon political parties, but also to other groups who try to influence elections. And in that sense, I think in the Netherlands, for instance, we had a code of conduct in which some specific agreements were made about how political parties should use targeting. And I think this is also a nice way to have some regulations around how you could use targeting, and then you can also use it in a positive way. I'm afraid that if you do completely ban it, it's also not providing political information which might be needed and also be used, especially among an upcoming voter group who is very much using online media to inform themselves about politics. So in that sense, my short answer, no, banning I think would not be a good option, but I think it should look for regulation and transparency, how we can inform people about this targeting and make them aware that they are interested and make the choice themselves, right? To either use it in a positive way.
So I can thank you very much, Sanne. I can already see that Brittany is nodding here, but maybe you also want to add something, please, Brittany.
Thank you so much. So I agree wholeheartedly with everything that was just said. For the past many years, I have called for the temporary banning of politically targeted ads while we figured out regulation, and while the platforms made the large-scale investment that is necessary to provide that type of transparency for auditing purposes. So I myself started my political career, or my career in terms of its intersection with technology, on a campaign that used technology for inherently positive purposes. So that would be to register people to vote, to get people to care about politics, to engage, to get their family members and friends to not just register to vote, but to actually show up on election day and to be more informed about politics and policies that were important to them and affected themselves and their communities. We need to make sure that those tools are still available for the majority of people who are going to use political advertising for positive, impactful purposes. What we're trying to do is make sure that both on the technology level and also in terms of legislation and regulation, that we are protecting citizens from bad actors, not banning the use of the technology itself, because that is unlikely to actually ever work or be enforceable. And I think it's incredibly important that if we are ever going to pass a law or a regulation, that it is 100% enforceable. Otherwise, it makes a lot of other laws and regulations more difficult to enforce on companies like Facebook. So what we need to think about is perhaps a law that would force companies like Facebook to have that transparency. So if the regulation said, for instance, that you could not send negative campaign ads that were intended to make people question their participation in an election, which obviously our voter suppression laws should already cover, but doesn't. If we were specifically to put forth that type of regulation, Facebook would need to be able to show transparently every single one of their users that spent political advertising money on their platform and which groups they targeted and what data they were targeted with. And so if that type of information would be readily available, which right now Facebook says it is not, then they need to make that investment in the back-end technology. And then the regulators need to actually have at least some sort of auditing body that is going to go through and periodically check that everyone is abiding by the law and they're doing what they're saying they're doing. So for me, I think a complete blanket ban would be very unenforceable. You'd be asking, a multi-billion-dollar market to shut down, and that is just going to be met with so much pushback. So instead, let's make sure that the bad actors don't have the ability to squeeze through and use this technology to negatively affect our democracy, while everyone else that is going to use it for the purposes with which it was originally intended still allow those activities to take place.
All right, thank you, Brittany and Simon. Do you agree with Brittany and Sanne, or do you have a different position when it comes to the ban of targeted advertising?
Well, at this point, I have to say I don't really agree, because I think, first of all, we have to realize that paid advertising, political advertising, is just a tiny bit of the whole problem. For example, the right-wing party in Germany spends nearly nothing on political advertising, but it has the biggest outreach for years now in social media. So I think what we really have to talk about is the way these platforms are designed, and are they designed in a way that this is beneficial for the political process and the political discourse? And I think they are not. So therefore, I would say banning is not the right way, but allowing it is not the right way either. We really have to change the structure of these platforms. And where I agree with what was said is that transparency, of course, is a key issue to this, because we just don't know what these companies are doing. And I used to work a lot with data from Facebook, from the ad library. So Facebook has increased the level of transparency when it comes to political ads quite a lot. So you can see every advertising that Facebook is labeling as political advertising in a special library, but you don't know to whom it was targeted, and you only get very rough numbers on how much was spent on this. So there are a lot of problems with this, but this might be a first step to force more transparency on this. And Germany is going very fast there in the new, let's call it anti-Facebook law, the NetzDG. There is the idea that these companies should be they have to share data with researchers in a special frame. So this might be a very good idea, but in the end, we still have a huge transparency problem because no one can really look inside the data of Facebook. And I was part of the Social Science One initiative. Mark Zuckerberg promised to share the biggest amount of data ever shared with anybody, and they were really just lying to us from the beginning to the end. Starting, the most obvious thing to see is the time scale of the data we got was after the Trump election and before the second Trump election started. So it's this is not real transparency, and this might be a way for regulators to think about other ways to force transparency on these platforms. But the second step will be to really develop new platforms that are not driven by economic interest, but they are driven by the interest of public good. And this is something we don't have right now.
Thank you, Simon. And both DSA and DMA, so Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, are aiming at also restructuring the digital market and defining also what platforms can do and cannot do in that market. But now I received several questions from those who are listening to us, and I would let Jessica ask what is a criteria for manipulation, what is good targeting, what is bad targeting, and that question goes to Sanne again. The criteria for manipulation.
So I think that's a difficult question, because I think criteria, what we see happening actually during elections, and this I think is also important, is you can target using Facebook data, for instance, on your political parties do that, right? So they target people who are more likely to vote for that party. So like for instance, the Greens, right? You are, as the Greens, you try to target voters who are likely to vote for this party. However, you can also try to shift it a little bit and try to target to neighboring parties, right? And so what is manipulation is, I think, is then also a difficult question to answer, because you could target, for instance, your own voters who are also likely to already vote for you, or you can try to target those voters who are probably voting for another party, but you can try to persuade them, and then you can try to persuade them to vote for you. But, and I think this is also very much a danger of political targeting, is try to suppress voting, right? So to make sure that some parties of voters are not going to cast their vote, and that would help the other party, right, to get more votes. And that's something what you saw, I think, in the US a lot, where this is also very much discussed, where you suppress the example that Brittany gave about the Clinton, that example. But I would say, so it's a difficult question to answer, because I think there are multiple mechanisms going on here. Yeah. Okay, there's not a very specific answer, but I would say there are different strategies, right? And different strategies are used, and depending on the strategy, you can see there is manipulation, but I would say it's more trying to persuade people to vote for you.
All right, thank you. And yes, indeed, it was a very difficult question to answer. And Thomas wants to know, what about other actors like big lobbies or other countries? Can they influence elections? And that question goes to Brittany.
Yes, absolutely. unfortunately, those that wield money in order to push out large-scale communications right now easily have the ability to influence elections. Unfortunately, a lot of communications that should be considered political in nature don't actually get flagged as such. This is why increased transparency and auditing on the back end of social media platforms is so incredibly important. You see more and more that big companies or even individual actors can pay to put out their communications, their advertising campaigns. And because they're not coming from regulated entities like a political party or a political action committee or some type of advocacy group, they are not deemed political. And therefore, the amount of money that's being spent on those types of communications is not regulated. And the content of those types of advertising are also not regulated. So I think it's really important for us to think about this when we're designing, again, legislation and regulation that is actually enforceable, which means probably in each country ahead of elections, we need to not just be monitoring political advertising, but advertising of all kinds from the commercial side as well.
All right, thank you. And someone else wants to know, unfortunately, I don't know who's asking, but question goes to Simon. Fake news spread faster. What does that mean for our democracy? Wants that person to know.
Well, first of all, this is a very solid research result. So from what we know from the research that is made, fake news really spreads faster than not fake news. It's always difficult to say what is fake news. So I really don't like this term so much because it lives from a binary distinction between truth and false. And when we look at these in detail, we will see often it's not so easy to say is it really false, or perhaps we just don't know yet. Yeah. So, but in general, it's the point is that content that is aiming on your emotions is spreading faster. And I think this is the leverage why fake news is spreading faster, because it's more emotional. But this means that the problem behind this is not only a problem for fake news, but also for normal news that is presented in an emotional way. Because what we see, and again, what Facebook knows since many, many years, is that the whole architecture of these platforms is driving polarization and radicalization. And this has a lot to do with the aim of engagement, that everybody should engage with the content on Facebook. And to make this a little bit more clear, perhaps, why this is so important, if you are aiming with the algorithms on engagement, but then you know that 25% of all the engagement is only done by 5% of the users. This means that 5% of the users more or less dominate the whole, let's say, newsfeed that you have on Facebook or on any other platform. And this is a real problem. So this leads to this wrong perception of reality. And it leads to polarization and radicalization. And I think this is a huge problem for our society right now, and we really should take action on this.
Yes, thank you, Simon, for also mentioning in your answer in the question of polarization, because someone wanted to know how we can depolarize social media. Since we have only 4 minutes left, Sanne, would you like to answer the question very, very briefly, and then I need to wrap up our excellent panel. So how to depolarize, and I think Simon already mentioned some things we could do, but yes, Sanne, please.
I think it's very much important to also, I'm also very much interested in how, on the one hand, you have transparency, right? And you can have regulations, but we also need to look at citizens, right? So how can we help citizens to deal with this information online communication, whether it's targeted or social media, will stay, and we will use it in our daily lives a lot, and I think it will only increase. So I think what's very important here is also to make citizens more literate about how to deal with targeted ads, but also with misinformation, disinformation, but also incivility online. There's also a lot, especially for instance on Twitter, there's also a lot of attacks, incivility, and I think this is something we should also, especially in schools, for instance, also teach children. But you also see, for instance, and I think this is also very interesting, that is fake news also spread by older generations, research shows, right? So I think this is also not something we should pay attention to also in classes, but also as a lifelong learning process, right? Where we learn how to deal with the digital world and how we can make ourselves or empower ourselves to deal with it better, and to help citizens to deal with this form of information. It will not go away, it will stay, right? So I think this is very important, and then I think this will also affect how we look at each other, and how are we I think how that we can overcome these cleavages or polarization.
All right.
So to end on a positive note, that might be good.
Yes, yes, you did. Thank you for that, because actually, unfortunately, I already have to wrap it up here. I want to thank you, Sanne, Brittany, and Simon, for your excellent contributions, for that very lively debate we had here today. I very much appreciate the exchange between politics and science, and there were further questions raised by our auditory. Those questions can, I'm sure, be discussed further on Twitter, because all of you have a Twitter account. Those Twitter accounts don't spread any disinformation, so people can just engage with you there. If you want to follow their work, meaning Sanne's, Brittany's, and Simon's work, just follow them. If you want to follow my political work, follow me. And I'm just closing with letting you know that this panel discussion has been recorded and will also been published in a few days. So have a nice evening. Follow the other panels, follow the keynotes that will now be presented by Shoshana Zuboff, and later the panels will be on protection of minors and marginalized groups, recommendation systems, and the lobbying of big tech. And having said that, I have to close this panel. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you soon in real life. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.